remember this guy?
West Bank, Gaza, it's about time we globalise the intifada!
That was the current head of the National Education Union, Daniel Kabidi, back at a rally in 2021 before he took on his new position. But today, the Met Police have announced a crackdown.
Words have meanings, words have consequences. We will act decisively, we will make arrests.
Yes, 2 years later. Now people holding placards or chanting the phrase globalise the intifada, the Arabic word for uprising, will now be arrested. Of course, it follows the recent spate of anti-Semitic attacks here in the UK and abroad. Speaking today, the London and Greater Manchester Police also said that they'll be stepping up protective patrols and security measures at schools and synagogues. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by journalist Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, welcome to the programme. He said that they're going to take decisive action. Seems a little bit too late. I mean, a little too late, surely. All these pro-Palestine protests have been going on for 2 years. We've had people shouting death to the IDF on stage, on the BBC of all people, I mean, of all places. Does this feel like too little too late?
The decision to arrest people chanting globalise the intifada isn't really a response to a changed context like the police are claiming, but it's actually a late admission that the authorities have ignored openly violent slogans like that for years, and what's really made them change their mind is bloodshed. 15 dead people, including a 10-year-old in Australia. Suddenly they begin to understand what it means to globalise the intifada. And of course, anyone who had their eyes open and who was being reasonable and honest about this in the beginning knew exactly what that meant. The first intifada began in 1987 and ran into the early 1990s. It was marked by sustained Palestinian violence against Israeli civilians and soldiers. That's stabbings, shootings, lynchings, petrol bombs, mass unrest, also organised incitement and mobilisation like we're seeing in our streets here in the UK. And then the second intifada from 2000 to around 2005, far more lethal. That was defined by waves of suicide bombings, people blowing up buses, restaurants, nightclubs, shootings, coordinated terror attacks. They deliberately targeted civilians and restaurants and cafes across city centres. And across both these periods, thousands were injured and over 1,000 Israelis were killed. And that is exactly what people have been calling for here in the UK. And only now, after the Bondi Beach massacre, our police beginning to say that they understand what that means. It's absolutely pathetic and shameful.
It seems pathetic and shameful, and it just does seem like a little bit too late. Do you think that this sort of poison can be dealt with now? Do you think that it's gone too far?
Of course it can be dealt with now, and of course it's gone too far. 2 people were killed on Yom Kippur at a synagogue, and there is a direct line between this kind of incitement and the kind of mob protests and mob behaviour being carried out across the UK, organised by groups like the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and Palestine Action, which has now been labelled a terrorist organisation in this country. Who is funding those groups? Very expensive to put on those sorts of mass rallies. Who is encouraging this behaviour? Why has the police, why have our politicians been turning a blind eye to this slow ratcheting up of hatred against Jewish people and, frankly, against British people, against Westerners, against our way of life? It's a form of anarchy that has been allowed to spread. They've turned a blind eye, and this kind of permission to behave that way only leads in one direction. It's exactly what happened in Israel. We saw it starting with protests and unrest, and even the Israelis themselves were too lenient on it, and eventually we saw where that leads on October the 7th, 2023, and I'm sorry to say that that is where it will lead here in the UK as well if it goes unchecked. So it is good that these 2 police forces have now said that they will start to arrest, though it's not clear that the Met are actually going to arrest straight away, that they may in fact be taking advice from the CPS first. Greater Manchester Police have said they will. What about West Midlands Police? How come they're not agreed to have signed up to this? This is very disjointed. It's pathetic. It's too slow. It needs to be happening faster. No more Jewish lives should be spent. No more blood needs to be spilled. And it's not just Jews. We've seen the spread of this kind of violence and terrorism, this kind of Muslim terrorism in Manchester Arena, London Bridge. We've seen people like Mike Freer have his office burnt down. We've seen again and again and again attacks on our way of life, and the police and the authorities and the politicians saying things like, well, jihad has a multitude of meanings. I mean, is jihad also going to be finally treated as it should have been all along, as well as calls for globalising the intifada? It's just so little, so late.
Why do you think, though, it took them so long to deal with it? Do you think that they were scared? Because, you know, if you say something bad, certain faith groups are not happy with what you say. There are a minority of those within those certain faith groups who may well take action against you.
Well, let's think about that logically. If you think that calling out such chants and movements and action which are leading towards and calling for the killing of Jewish people in the UK, if you think that's going to upset Muslims in the UK, I would say that is a pretty racist or anti-Muslim or negative or discriminatory opinion of all Muslims in the UK. So you've got a problem there. Either you believe, if that's the authorities' position, that all Muslims are behind that kind of behaviour, or you believe that they're not, but you're failing to protect those who aren't because you're terrified as the decision makers of those who are in favour of violence, of the Islamists within Islam. So either way, again, what we're seeing is weak and pathetic politicians and leaders, and weakness is the thing that leads towards more of this behaviour, not less. In the face of that weakness, we will see more and more of these protests, these mobs, these violent actions, these calls for violence, these calls for murder, these calls for bloodshed, and that will lead to action, that will lead to murder and bloodshed and violence. And we have seen it. 2 people dead in Manchester in a synagogue, 15 people dead on Bondi Beach, many Jews over the last few decades killed across Europe, whether it's been in France or in Brussels, wherever it goes on. We've even seen a Jewish man killed now in the last few days in the United States, believed to be because of his religion. This sort of stuff needs to be stopped across the world. The West needs to really understand the problem that it's imported from the Middle East, from the Muslim Brotherhood. The problem that it's imported is indeed this spread of intifada, this desire to spread violence against Jews and non-Muslims, against the West, against our values. Yes, bravo if they're going to finally start arresting people calling for the death of Jews, i.e. globalising the intifada. But it can't just be that. It needs to be so much more. When it was revealed in the last sort of few months of 2023, I think it was in November, there was that footage that was broadcast on TV of speeches and sermons in mosques in the UK calling for violence against Jews and against Israel, calling for death. I don't believe anybody was arrested or put in jail for those things. I don't think anything was done about that. This just needs to be firmly stopped across the board using existing laws. There are existing laws against inciting violence and murder and bloodshed against Jewish people, against non-Muslims, against Brits. It just needs to be applied properly. Less cowardice, more action.
And I guess on some of those protests, and a lot of those protests, many were calling for peace, but however they were in a protest of people who were chanting "Mobilise the Intifada" and all that kind of stuff.
I never heard them calling for peace, by the way. I never heard them calling for peace. I never.
Well, some people would say that, but when you ask some people, they say that there were some Jewish people on the protest, and they often say that we were just because of all the people dying in Gaza, which is totally understandable, that you might be upset about that. But when you're part of a protest where there are some people chanting evil things, then if you're not part of the problem, you're part of if you're not part of the solution even, you're part of the problem. Jonathan Sacerdoti, thank you very much. Really good to talk to you. That is Jonathan Sacerdoti. He's a journalist